Capitalism always delivers justice to those who mess around on economic matters. This is true with individuals, companies, countries, continents, and even the supposedly untouchable multinational corporations. Unfortunately, it can take years or sometimes decades, in the case of countries and continents, until that said justice is delivered. But it always comes. It came for Greece after almost 20 years of messing around and fooling everyone. It's currently coming for China after almost 40 years of hiding and bending reality. And the current recession is also bringing justice to one of the older friends of the sofa, the corporate diversity, equity and inclusion officers. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. So, as I was waiting for yet another Stalin video to download, from which I will likely use 3 or 4 seconds in one of the next episodes from the Central Asia featured series, for which I've been working quite on assiduously lately. So, while I was waiting for that, someone sent me this link. Now, make no mistake, people send me links all the time, and it's a task in and of itself to select what to click and what not to click, and then on what to read and what not to read. But this one was too good not to click on it. In fact, it was so good not to make a video. It would have been quite a shame not to make a video about it. So, we'll go through the article, laugh a bit, and then get a bit more serious, okay? So here we go. Bloomberg, big tech layoffs are hitting diversity and inclusion jobs hard. Companies that made promises to hire more underrepresented groups are gutting departments meant to achieve these goals. Uh-oh. So you're saying that those who fucked around are finally finding out? That's so interesting. Quote, listings for DEI roles were down 19% last year, a bigger decline than legal or general human resources jobs saw, according to findings from Textio, which helps companies create unbiased job ads. Now, this company should also go bust. Only software engineering and data science jobs saw larger declines, minus 24% and minus 27% respectively. Bloomberg News identified DEI professionals who lost their jobs in recent weeks at Amazon.com Incorporated, Meta Platforms Incorporated, Twitter, and Redfin Corp. Many said they expect their responsibilities will go to former colleagues who remain or to employee resource groups, which often don't get compensated for that work. A spokesperson for Amazon said the company's DEI priorities haven't changed and the company remains committed to its goals. A Redfin spokesperson said the company has invested in growing its DEI team since 2021, and despite a recent layoff, the group is larger than it was at the start of 2022. A representative for Meta, that would be Facebook, declined to comment. I'm cautiously concerned, not that these roles will go to zero, but that there will be a spike in Swiss Army knife type roles, meaning more DEI professionals will be spread thin as they take on additional job functions, said Textio Chief Executive Officer Kieran Snyder. The phenomenon isn't likely limited to tech either, as layoffs hit other parts of the economy. Last year, companies announced plans to cut over 363,000 jobs, up 13% from 2021. All right, let me stop here for a bit. So, these are in fact two great news. A decline in DEI and software engineers. And by that I mean, of course, code monkeys, because I always laugh when basic bitch terminally online code monkeys are called engineers. Title inflation is real, folks. I mean, knowing some CSS or how to query an API doesn't make you an engineer. I'm sorry. Anyway, here comes the less fun part. Quote, recent years have seen a diversity and inclusion hiring boom. After Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, organizations of all stripes made promises to boost gender and racial diversity in their ranks. Dozens brought in their first ever chief diversity and inclusion officers. In the 3 months after George Floyd's murder, DEI job postings jumped to 123%, according to data from job sites Indeed. Now, just as tech companies had started to make progress, they're scaling back these teams before fully meeting goals or creating workforces that look like the broader US population. Meta Chief Diversity Officer Maxine Williams warned last summer that the cost cutting would slow its diversity hiring efforts, close quote. Translation: the finding out is just at the beginning. The DEI grift was up 123% in 2020, and now it's down only 19%. So you gotta pump those numbers up. I mean, corporate America, seriously, pump those numbers up. This is rookie numbers, right? I'm just saying. On a more serious note, the way you know all of this was a grift is precisely because nobody relevant is upset by the end of the program. I mean, yeah, sure, those who stood to gain from this personally, from this grift, of course they are very upset, but everyone else, not so much. Also, you know none of this was serious because if the goal was to create workforces that look like the broader US population, then that would have meant firing 50% at the very least of the H-1B visa holders, who tend to be overwhelmingly Indian. Indian as in from India, born and raised in India. Now, have you noticed? Seriously, have you noticed just how heavily overrepresented Indians are, particularly in so-called leadership or visible roles in so-called tech? And again, I'm talking here particularly of H-1B visa holders, not of Indian Americans. Those are citizens, and of course those are they have the freedom to do whatever they want, and they are in fact less than 2% of the US population. But Indians make way in excess of 20% of the so-called tech workforce in the United States. Oh, hold on a second. What does Business Insider say? 30 to 40% of laid-off techies in the US are Indians, most on H-1B and L-1 visas. Oh, so there you go. In fact, this is perfectly in line with the goal to create workforces that look like the broader US population. By firing tens of thousands of Indians and reducing the proportion of Indians in tech to no more than 5%, this, in fact, serves an equity purpose. Now, am I doing this right? Anyway, back to Bloomberg. Here's the reply of the grifters to the situation. Quote, cutting DEI-oriented staff now, unless you've made really progress, I guess they meant real progress, and can say mission accomplished, is not a good look, says Angie Kamath, Dean at the NYU School of Professional Studies, who focuses on workforce development. There are some real risks. In some cases, companies might even backslide, said Mon Williams, an Atlanta-based partner at McKinsey & Company. Workers are more likely to leave companies where equity efforts aren't a priority. Nearly 1 in 5 female leaders have left a job in the past 2 years because of a company's lack of commitment to DEI, according to an October report, again from McKinsey and leanin.org. In a 2019 survey of 2,000 workers, McKinsey found that 39% decided against pursuing or accepting a job because of a perceived lack of inclusion at a company. Diversity, equity, and inclusion can't be a thing that you only do when times are good, Williams said. If it becomes a flavor of the week, then companies will lose out on talent, unquote. Okay, so here's a life hack. When reading these kinds of news, when you hear or read whatever partner of McKinsey said, just presume you are at the very least misled, if not outright lied to. Why? Because that's the business of McKinsey, misleading the public. Now, see, McKinsey is a multi-billion-dollar consulting corporation that doesn't even have a headquarters. Seriously, look it up, don't trust me. It has almost 100 years of history and almost none of it good for society. They exist solely to harm you for the benefit of their clients. In fact, their consultants are prohibited from even considering the good of the market or even the good of McKinsey itself before the good of their clients, which is probably why they're so sought after. Puneet Dixit, Rajat Gupta, and Anil Kumar are just the last 3 McKinsey partners to have gone to jail for securities fraud and insider trading just this decade. I'm sure it's a pure coincidence. They're all Indians too. But the point is not to quip about Indian coincidences. After all, Indian Americans are the highest earning ethnic group in the United States, so statistically it stands to reason that there would be more Indians than usual overrepresented in this highly specific category of crime. The point, however, is to name the grifters. McKinsey & Company, leanin.org, and the dean at the NYU School of Professional Studies are all in on the scheme. They get a cut from all of this, or at least they got one. It's all a money-making scheme off the backs of those who do real work by blackmailing dumb enough corporate middle managers or startup CEOs. In other words, grifting. Now, McKinsey in particular is always very aggressive at defending their grifts. They defended the mass surveillance and censorious regime of the CCP because they consulted for it, various crimes in Saudi Arabia because they consulted for it, the Enron fraud. I mean, heck, even the opioid epidemic in the United States is at least in part the fault of McKinsey. Purdue Pharma, while by no means innocent, just happened to be the suckers to hold the bag, while the much guiltier parties, such as McKinsey, who also made sure the Sackler family isn't too severely bothered by the mess they created, they all got away from any PR mess. Speaking of which, a certain manufacturer of clot shots that happens to be the recipient of the biggest criminal fine in the history of the United States is also consulted by, you guessed it, McKinsey. But please don't notice that, or you'll be called a conspiracist, okay? In any event, McKinsey aside, the claims made in this article are quite extraordinary, yet the necessary extraordinary evidence isn't offered for them. And you will excuse me if I don't accept surveys from McKinsey as evidence. Again, the job of McKinsey is to defend the grift. Workers are more likely to leave companies where equity efforts aren't a priority? Really? I mean, don't get me wrong, I wish that were true, because that would mean the cure is a 5-year recession and everyone will be cured of such disorders. But I just have a hard time believing that's true. Nearly 1 in 5 female leaders have left a job in the past 2 years because of a company's lack of commitment to DEI, says McKinsey. Oh, really? Because if that's true, then that's great news. I mean, if women don't want to work because the company is committed to making more money rather than making insecure people feel good about themselves while they pay a cut from their income to grifters like McKinsey and Company, then perhaps it is true that women don't deserve to be in leadership roles. Of course, that's probably nonsense too. Women are people, so as a statistical norm, they'll be guided by the same rules of human nature that everyone else is. Sure, sex differences are real, something which McKinsey professes to believe when it's convenient, but then openly denies when working on a different grift. But sex differences notwithstanding, I find it very hard to believe that 20% of women are mentally deficient. Because yes, the idea of quitting a leadership role because there's not enough militant leftism in a company, so not an NGO, but a company, now that is mental. But wait, other grifters have a solution too. Quote, partly at issue is that companies tend to lean on a last-in, first-out approach to layoffs, said Brooks Scott, founder and CEO of executive coaching firm Merging Path Coaching. Companies have rushed to think of the bottom line, but whenever we try to optimize for speed, we're probably going to skip over diversity, equity, and inclusion. Instead, he said companies should consider race, gender, and ethnicity when deciding who to let go. In addition, organizations confronting slimmed-down DEI departments don't have to abandon goals altogether, said Julie Kaufman, the chief diversity officer at consulting firm Bain & Company. The decisions to hire, promote, and foster talented people lie across departments. The actual job of delivering real progress on DEI outcomes does not reside in a central chief diversity officer or a small DEI team alone, she said. At Twitter, the diversity, equity, and inclusion team is down to just 2 people from 30. One former employee said, Elon, that's 2 people too many. I'm just saying. A DEI worker who was let go from a popular ride-sharing company said their job search has stalled as other technology companies assess their finances. And just before getting the axe at separate tech giants this fall, 2 DEI specialists and leadership had stopped setting long-term goals for their departments entirely. The layoffs sweeping the technology industry are gutting diversity and inclusion departments, threatening company pledges to boost underrepresented groups in their ranks and leadership. Close quote. Right. So, you should consider race, gender, and ethnicity when deciding who to let go, says Merging Path Coaching. A piece of advice which really means fire more white men. Now, what is Merging Path Coaching, you may ask? Well, it's a corporate religious cult, fundamentally speaking. The revenue of the company is from the self-help material that it sells. It's paid for sermons, training and coaching sessions, and of course a cut from every person that they bring into a firm. The CEO, Mr. Scott, is essentially Al Sharpton for corporate NPCs. He's a race hustler. In fact, he doesn't even call himself a CEO. Here's how he insisted on being described in an interview that he did last year. Quote, Brooks E. Scott is the chief culture curator of Merging Path Coaching. He works as an executive coach, interpersonal communications expert, and diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic advisor. His work is focused on helping people have all the conversations that we continue to avoid in the workplace and in our personal lives. Unquote. I'm sorry, who calls himself a chief culture curator? I suppose guru was already taken. So of course this guy will come with the magical solution of firing more white men. Why? Because he probably assessed that white men are the least likely customers to his grift. His advice is there to protect his very mundane pecuniary interest. Follow the money may be a cliche, but it's also true. Once you understand that these people are in it solely for the money and you analyze their arguments through a financial lens first, then it becomes easier to figure it out. Sure, that doesn't mean some of them don't also believe what they say, of course. I mean, believing one's propaganda is pretty common in the world of grift, but more often than not, it's really all about the shekels. The problem they're facing now, however, is that it's all about the shekels for everyone else too, particularly the tech CEOs and especially the so-called tech investors. You see, this is where it gets interesting, because it's this part of the economy, this part of the economic cycle where the jig is up. Many of these so-called tech companies like Uber, Lyft, Twitter, Meta, and so on and so forth were never profitable. They were merely burning through investor capital. Now that's all fine and dandy as long as there's cheap money around. Near zero interest rates makes the existence of such anomalies possible. Companies tried really hard to grow fast, not for the purpose of serving the customers and turning a profit, but just to grow for the sake of growing, regardless of how much it cost both themselves personally and the society at large. Cheap money made tech bros think they know everything and exacerbated the mentality that disruption for disruption's sake is a good thing. The New York Times, a former newspaper, has a recent article, in a recent article they presented very nicely such a case. Allow me to read some of that for you. Where the hell is it? Okay, yeah, there we go. Quote, Carvana, like many startups, pulled a page out of Amazon's old playbook, trying to get a big fast. Used cars, it believed, were a highly fragmented market ripe for reinvention, just the way taxis, bookstores, and hotels had been. It strove to outdistance any competition. The company, based in Tempe, Arizona, wanted to replace traditional dealers with Carvana, said grandly, technology and exceptional customer service. In what seemed to symbolize the death of the old way of doing things, it paid $22 million for a 6-acre site in San Diego that a Mazda dealer had occupied since 1965. Where traditional dealerships were literally flat, Carvana built multi-story car vending machines that became memorable local landmarks. Customers picked up their cars at these towers, which now total 33. A corporate video of the building of one vending machine has over 4 million views on YouTube. In the third quarter of 2021, Carvana delivered 110,000 cars to customers, up 74% from 2020. The goal, 2 million cars a year, which would make it by far the largest used car retailer. Then, even more quickly than the company grew, it fell apart. When used car sales rose more than 25% in the first year of the pandemic, that created a supply problem. Carvana needed many more vehicles. It acquired a car auction company for $2.2 billion and took on even more debt at a premium interest rate. And it paid customers handsomely for cars. But as the pandemic waned and interest rates began to rise, sales slowed. Carvana, which declined to comment for this article, of course, did a round of layoffs in May and another one in November. Its chief executive, Ernie Garcia, blamed the higher cost of financing, saying, "We failed to accurately predict how all this will play out." Some competitors are even worse off. Vroom, a Houston company, has seen its stock fall to $1 from $65 in mid-2020. Over the past year, it has dismissed half of its employees. High rates are painful for almost everyone, but they are particularly painful for Silicon Valley, says Kai-Rong Tiao, an associate professor of finance at Columbia Business School. "I expect more layoffs and investment cuts unless the Fed reverses its tightening. At the moment, there is little likelihood for that. The market expects 2 more rate increases by the Federal Reserve this year to at least 5%, unquote." Well, now, these, what do you call them? Sorrow stories, I guess? These sorrow stories are ubiquitous now. Remember the Uber files? Oh, sorry, you may not remember the Uber files because McKinsey does the consulting for that too, so the scandal has been quickly buried. But while it was buried from the front pages of the media, it wasn't buried for policymakers around the world. You see, Uber broke not just the customs of the taxi medallion cartel, which is a corporate phrase coined by McKinsey, by the way, but they also broke the laws concerning racketeering, corruption, bribery, blackmail, and even espionage of multiple countries around the world. Monsieur Macron, president of France, for instance, was in on the corruption with Uber. Imagine that. A national leader cutting a deal with a not profitable foreign company at the explicit expense of his fellow countrymen, namely the working-class taxi drivers in France. And all of this was sold to the plebs as technological progress. And whoever disagreed was either a Luddite or part of the taxi mafia. To cushion the deal, Uber also came in with cheaper fares, so all good, right? Well, yeah, sure, there's just one problem. None of that was real. The model was not a business model. Uber never turned a nickel in profit. But for many years, this wasn't a big issue since low interest rates meant the charade could go on. But at some point, like these days for instance, money became no longer free, which triggered a chain reaction of decisions. First by the investors, who started asking for some profits of the companies they were investing in, then by the CEOs, who asked down the food chain to have some fat cut in order to at least cut some losses, if not get to profitability. And from there on, downstream, eventually one reached this particular thing, the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Office. Oftentimes the investors had no idea about this. I know I assisted to such a discussion last year, and one of the investors was like, "Hold on, I'm paying for this shit? But why?" And the executive's answer was simply, "Well, the employees like it." I'm serious. Oftentimes, and this is the part that people need to understand, oftentimes this woke nonsense got into many companies through the loudmouths among the employees. Of course, some of them had an ideological agenda of subversion, for instance. Others were true believers that such an office would make things better, but quite a few of them had their own financial interest in mind. In fact, if you dig deep enough, you will see that many of these corporate sectarian grifts, like merging path coaching, in fact have a partner or a shareholder already in the companies that act as their customers. Or a relative or close friend of the grifter works in that company, or the grift is recommended to the company by a third party who just happens to be friends with the grifter. This is almost always the case. Sure, some can frame this as money laundering, and sometimes that is the case as well, but more often than not, it's just a good old grift, like the investing advice gurus, for instance, who actually make their money through book sales rather than their great deals. You see, it's all about the grift, all of it. And all that house of cards, well, is now slowly coming down crashing. Ideally, the Fed should continue to raise the interest rate and keep it high at least until 2030. Now that would achieve a glorious Great Reset, namely a corporate environment with so many of these grifters resetted out of existence and or back to flipping burgers. Or maybe they learn to weld. Trades will continue to be well paid for many years to come, so, there's that. Because the issue goes a lot deeper than the diversity, equity, and inclusion departments. The issue goes to the very notion of tech as it is understood today. I mean, for crying out loud, Salesforce borrowed $10 billion, added another $18 billion out of their own money, and paid $28 billion for a glorified IRC server called Slack. There's no way you can convince me, or really anyone reasonable or even semi-reasonable, that Slack was worth $28 billion. The reason that transaction was possible is because of cheap money. And the same goes with Carvana that I mentioned earlier. Their valuation at some point was closing in on $100 billion when they were owning 3 buildings and selling a few hundred cars. But the problem is not that these grifters are losing. I mean, they deserve to lose, and I'm so happy that this is happening to them. Their investors also deserve to lose, and their workers too, who, by the way, should learn to weld. So the problem is not that these techno-optimists and that some speculators are losing. After all, shit happens in business. The problem is that the destruction left behind them is rarely picked up by some other business that wants to give it a shot at turning it around. There are some exceptions. For instance, the recently closed Amazon physical shops are now being gobbled up at a steep discount by actual bookstore chains who are in fact in the business of promoting and selling books rather than growth for the sake of growth and Orwellian mass surveillance. But what about all the cab drivers all over the world who got pushed out of the market, not because they made a wrong decision, not because the state abused them, although in the case of France the state did abuse them, but because someone thousands of kilometers away decided to borrow cheap money and give it to a CEO who never had a business plan. A lot of cities are now left in a worse shape. Fewer Ubers because it's no longer worth it for the drivers either. The Ubers that are around are prohibitively expensive, and also fewer taxis because many dropped out, unable to compete with the disloyal competition by Uber, who did not in fact have a superior business model, but was merely being subsidized. There's plenty of tragedies generated by this crap, and those aggrieved have zero recourse. At least American citizens can vote in politicians who take a more techno-conservative position, and there are a few of those, both on the right and on the left. But what can those from Italy or Spain do? Vote in more right-wing politicians? Yeah, sure, they did that in Italy and will likely do so in Spain this year as well, but so what? They can't rein in on the so-called tech sector, at least not easily. Luckily, though, good old capitalism is coming to their aid, but unfortunately, it may be too late for some. And this is the lesson that at least non-leftists have to learn from this. Technological development for the sake of technological development is exactly like change for the sake of change. It's not just wrong, it's dangerous. Disrupting the taxi mafia appealed to many non-leftists, and sure, in some cities the taxi lobby was supremely annoying, offering subpar service and acting as a monopolistic force, but replacing the local mafia with an internationalist mafia turned out to be the wrong bet. See, the local mafia has local constraints. If the cabbies become too uptight, there are methods to straighten them out. They don't have a monopoly on thuggery, after all. But when it comes to an internationalist mafia, there are no constraints. The little guy stood no chance against a company with virtually unlimited promotional budget. If they can afford to buy the president of France, what chance does a cabbie from Firenze or Bologna or Sevilla really have? Sometimes, though I would argue that this is a matter of routine, the devil that you know is still preferable. Too many non-leftists seriously believe that there is a shortcut to hard work through so-called tech. Well, that was wrong. There is no shortcut. Are the cabbies too uptight? Well, lobby your city hall, attend council meetings, associate with your fellow citizens, and in extremis, run for local office and change the policy. Yes, it's hard work, but it also works and doesn't bring in violence upon your city and doesn't violently pit your fellow citizens against each other like Uber purposefully did in Johannesburg, Brussels, Rome, Sevilla, Paris, and so many other places. And that's the political side of the story. And then there is the actual tech side of the story, which hopefully I will cover one day. I generally try to stay away from that topic because I've been out of the industry for too many years because of the political aspect. Nevertheless, I still have eyes and I still know how to read code, though I would never dare call myself an engineer like these Stack Overflow or more recently ChatGPT copy-pastars dare call themselves. But for now, suffice to say that all consumer tech, yes all, not a single exception, is built on hype, make-believe, unsustainable economic foundations, and of course, grift and lying. Business-to-business tech still has some connection to reality and market needs, though it's getting ugly even there too. The good news is that we're not heading into a tech-driven dystopia anytime soon. The quality of the software is continuously declining, and the new so-called engineers are significantly dumber than the previous generations. Ironically, that is also happening thanks to tech itself. The bad news, however, is that we're heading into a future where a lot more people are going to be harmed economically, mentally, and physically as a result of tech hype. The mRNA shots are just the latest example, but a lot more of those will come. Just an FYI, so yeah, I'm just saying. Alright, yeah, that's all I had to say for now. Thank you for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, and I shall get back to working on the Central Asia series, and soon enough we'll announce the fundraiser for the Cambodia Laos tour. See you all soon on the Freedom Alternative. Cheers.